In a forest west of Moscow, a woman kneels in the moss and lifts away a handful of leaves, and underneath them is a soldier. He has been lying there for 80 years, exactly where he fell, a few inches beneath the ground the whole time, close enough to the surface that a metal detector found him in an afternoon. There is not much left: a helmet, thinned by rust, the bones of a young man, and, if the family that loved him were very lucky, one small black capsule, the size of a thumb, with a curl of paper still rolled up inside. That capsule is the only thing in the world that might still hold his name. Not a fingerprint, not a record in a file, not a photograph matched to a face, just a curl of paper in a plastic tube, and the hope that a frightened young man, 80 years ago, took the time to write on it. Across the forests and fields of the old Eastern Front, there are millions like him. Not buried, not found, not named. When the Second World War ended, the Soviet Union counted, among its losses, a number so large it stops meaning anything the moment you say it. Around 4.5 million of its soldiers were listed as missing. Missing. Not dead, not buried. Missing. It is a word that promises nothing and forecloses nothing. It does not let the living bury their grief, and it does not let them keep their hope. It simply leaves the door ajar, forever. This is the story of what that word was hiding, and of the people who, generations later, still walk into the woods every spring to undo it, one name at a time. To understand how a country loses 4.5 million of its own, you have to understand who they were, and how little the machinery of that war was built to remember them. They were, most of them, very young and very ordinary. Farm boys from Ukraine and Belarus, factory workers from the cities, herders from the mountains of the Caucasus and the plains of Central Asia, men who in some cases did not speak Russian and had never been more than a day's walk from the village where they were born. They were conscripted in their millions, handed a rifle and a uniform, and sent west toward the largest invasion in the history of the world. The country they were defending was almost too large to imagine, 11 time zones wide, and the men who filled its armies came from every corner of it. When the call came, they left half-finished harvests, and new marriages, and children who would grow up on a single photograph. Many of them could not have found, on a map, the places where they would die. They went because they were told to go, and because behind them were the homes and the people they loved, and that, for most men in most wars, has always been reason enough. There is a statistic about that generation that is difficult to hold in the mind. Of the Soviet men born in 1922 and 1923, the boys who came of military age exactly when the war began, it is estimated that around 8 in 10 did not live to see the peace. Think about that for a moment. A boy in a classroom, and the 9 others in his row. 8 of them would not come home. That was not a battle. That was an entire generation, walking into the dark. And the ones who fell were not, in the main, the subject of songs. There were heroes among them, of course. Men whose courage was written down and remembered. But the vast majority were simply present, ordinary men doing what was asked, until the day it killed them. History would keep the names of the generals. The rest would become a number. And when they went, most of them carried almost nothing that could identify them. The Red Army did issue a kind of identification. It was a small capsule, made of a dark plastic called bakelite, and inside it went a slip of paper on which a soldier was meant to write his details, twice, so that one copy could be kept when he was buried. It was a quiet, sensible little object, and many of the men refused to use it. There was a belief in the ranks, never official, never written down, that to fill out your death capsule was to invite your own death. To seal your name inside that tube was to admit you were going to need it. So men left the paper blank. Some threw the capsule away entirely. Some used them to hold sewing needles or tobacco, anything but the thing they were made for. It is said that a soldier who filled out his capsule was thought to be tempting fate. We cannot know how many made that choice, but we know the cost of it. Because when those men fell, and the earth took them. The one object that could have carried their names home was empty. Then came the way they died. In the summer of 1941, when Germany invaded, whole Soviet armies were surrounded and swallowed in a matter of weeks. Not thousands of prisoners, millions. In encirclement after encirclement, entire fronts collapsed, and the men in them simply vanished into captivity. Near the city of Kiev, in the autumn of that first year, a pocket closed around a force so large that the number taken prisoner ran into the hundreds of thousands in a single catastrophe. Weeks later, further north, near a town called Vyazma, it happened again on a similar scale. These were not skirmishes. Each was a disaster that erased an army, and in the space of a few months the Soviet Union lost more men into captivity than some nations sent into uniform in the entire war. And captivity, for a Soviet soldier, was very often a death sentence carried out slowly. Of the roughly 5.5 million Red Army soldiers who fell into German hands over the course of the war, historians estimate that more than 3 million died in that captivity. Most of them did not die in battle. They died behind wire, in open fields with no shelter, through the deliberate withholding of food through the first terrible winter of the war. In a matter of months, in late 1941 and early 1942, some 2 to 3 million Soviet prisoners were dead. It remains one of the largest and least spoken of mass deaths of the entire war. They died of hunger, of cold, of the diseases that swept through camps where men had no shelter but the holes they scraped in the earth with their hands. The system that held them had not planned to feed them, because feeding them had never been the intention. And when they died, they were tipped into the ground in numbers, without ceremony, without record, in the corners of a continent that would spend the next 4 years being fought over again and again. These men have no graves in any meaningful sense. They were buried in pits, in numbers no one recorded, in places that were never marked. Their names, if the Germans wrote them at all, were written as figures in a ledger, not as men, and so a soldier captured near the border in July of 1941 could be dead by Christmas, in a pit in a foreign country, while a letter from his mother was still traveling toward a front that no longer existed. For those who were not captured, there was the fighting itself, and the fighting on the Eastern Front consumed men on a scale that has no equal. There is a place, a small town in Western Russia, whose name became a byword for that scale. For more than a year, from the start of 1942 into the spring of 1943, the Red Army threw offensive after offensive against the German lines around it. The gains were measured in yards, the losses were measured in the hundreds of thousands, and then in the millions. The soldiers who fought there gave it a name that needed no explanation. They called it the meat grinder. Wave after wave went forward across the same few miles of ruined ground, into fire that did not stop, for objectives that changed hands and changed back. The town itself was reduced to almost nothing, and the men who died taking it and retaking it and losing it again fell into ground so churned by shelling that the earth itself seemed to swallow them. Estimates of the Soviet casualties in that one long battle range from over 1 million to well beyond 2 million men. Many of them were never recovered. They fell in the marshes and the birch woods, and the front moved back and forth across their bodies. And by the time the guns moved on, there was no one left who could say where any single one of them lay. Multiply that across 1,000 miles of front and 4 years of war, and you begin to see how a number like 4.5 million becomes possible. It is not one great tragedy. It is millions of small ones, each of them a single man, lying where he fell, with no cross, no capsule, no witness left alive. And here we come to the hardest part of the story, the silence that followed. In many countries, the end of the war began a long and careful effort to find the missing, to recover the dead, to give them names and graves. The Soviet Union, for the most part, did not do this. The scale was one reason. You cannot easily search for 4.5 million men. But it was more than scale. A soldier who was missing was, in the eyes of a suspicious state, a soldier who might have surrendered. And surrender had been branded a betrayal. Families of the missing sometimes found themselves under a shadow, their pensions withheld, their questions unwelcome. The safest thing, for a grieving mother, was often to say nothing, to fold the last letter away and grieve in private. There would be no official search, no company of men sent back to open the field graves and read the papers and carry the fallen to a marked cemetery, as other armies did. There were simply too many, across too vast a country, and there was too little will, in a state that preferred its dead counted in the millions rather than named one by one. The missing became a silence with a number attached, and the number was so enormous that it became a kind of hiding place. You cannot picture 4.5 million faces. That, perhaps, is the point. A single lost boy is unbearable. 4.5 million is a statistic, and a statistic can be set down and left. The country had won the greatest victory in its history, at the greatest cost any nation paid, and the individual dead, the 4.5 million with no grave, were quietly folded into that enormous total and left in the ground. The telegrams that went out did not even offer the finality of death. Many families received a single, terrible phrase. Their son had gone missing without a trace. No body, no place, no date they could be sure of, just a young man who had walked west one day and never resolved into either the living or the dead. A mother could spend the rest of her life not knowing whether to mourn or to hope. Some kept a place set at the table. Some left a light on. For decades. That was where the story stopped. For a very long time. A generation in the ground, and a country that had turned its face away. But it did not stop forever, because the forests remembered, even when the state did not. Starting in the decades after the war, and growing into a movement of thousands, ordinary people began to go out into the old battlefields to look. They are not soldiers. They are teachers, students, mechanics, retirees. Every spring, when the snow melts, and before the undergrowth returns, they walk the woods with metal detectors and probes and their own hands. They call it the search. And what they are searching for is not treasure, it is men. The soldiers, they will tell you, are not buried deep. They are found just beneath the moss, under a few years of fallen leaves layered into soil, still lying where they died. A helmet, a rifle, the small bones of the hand, and always, always, the searchers are hoping for the same thing. That black capsule. Because the capsule, if the paper inside survived, and if the man ever filled it out, can give back the one thing the war took that can still be returned. A name. Most of the time, there is no capsule, or it is empty, or the paper has rotted to nothing. Those men are reburied with honor, but as unknowns, the same word carved over them that was carved over so many others. Each spring the searchers gather what they have found over a season and lay them to rest together, with an honor guard, and the families of the few who could be named standing among them. It is a strange and moving thing, a funeral 8 decades late, for men who were boys when they died, and who would now be older than anyone alive. The soil gives them up slowly. A season of digging might return a few dozen, or a few hundred, from ground that holds tens of thousands. But sometimes, rarely, the paper survives. A curl of it, brittle and stained, with a name and a village still legible in faded pencil. Written twice, as the instructions once demanded, so that if one copy failed the other might survive. For 80 years that small precaution waits in the dark, and then a stranger's hands unroll it, and a man who was a number becomes a name again. And then something extraordinary begins. The searchers become detectives. They trace the village, they find the records, and sometimes, at the end of that trail, there is a family, a niece who never met him, a grandson who grew up hearing that great-grandfather went to the war and never came back, and nothing more. Imagine being that grandson. Imagine the phone call. 80 years after a boy vanished into the largest silence in modern history, A stranger calls to tell you they have found him, that they know where he was the whole time, that they can bring him home. One group of searchers, over the years, has recovered the remains of more than 4,000 men, 4,000, from one group, and they are a small part of a movement that has laid to rest hundreds of thousands. Against 4.5 million, it can seem like almost nothing, a teaspoon against an ocean, and yet to each family at the end of each trail, it is everything. That is the quiet mathematics of remembrance. It does not work at the scale of millions. It only ever works at the scale of one. In recent years, a vast memorial was raised near that town they called the meat grinder. A soldier, tens of feet high, rising out of a flock of cranes, the birds that in that part of the world are said to carry the souls of the fallen. There is an old song there about soldiers who did not return from the fields of blood, who became not earth but white cranes, and who call down to the living as they pass overhead. It is only a song. But standing beneath that memorial, it is not hard to understand why people needed to believe it. It is a beautiful and a haunting thing, but the truest memorial to these men is not made of bronze. It is a person on their knees in a forest in April, brushing the soil from a stranger's bones, hoping for a name. So why does it matter, all these years later? The men are gone. Nothing will bring back the boy born in 1922. A name found now cannot give him back the life he did not get to live. He will not grow old. He will not see the country he died for, or hold the grandchildren he never had. All of that is gone, and no discovery reverses it. And yet, there is a difference between a man who is dead and a man who is lost. A death can be mourned. A death has a place, a date, an end. But 4.5 million of these soldiers were denied even that. They were not allowed to be dead. They were only missing, suspended forever between grief and hope. Their mothers never told, their graves never dug, their names slipping year by year out of living memory, until there was no one left who could even say them aloud. To find one of them, to read the faded paper and speak the name and lay him in the ground with it carved above him, is not to undo his death. It is to end his disappearance. It is to move him, at last, from the column marked missing to the column marked home. And it changes something for the living too. Scaried, a question for 3 generations can finally set it down. The grandchildren can stand at a grave instead of a blank space. The story stops being about a man who disappeared and starts being about a man who was found. That is not a small thing to give a family. It may be the only thing left that anyone can give them. Think back to that woman in the forest, on her knees in the moss, lifting away 80 years of fallen leaves. She will do this again next spring, and the spring after that, for as long as she is able, and when she can no longer do it, someone younger will take her place. Because the arithmetic is impossible, and they know it. They will never find them all. There are too many, spread across too much ground, and most of them left no name to find. But that has never been the point. The point is the one, the single capsule that still holds its paper, the single name that can still be spoken, the single family that can finally stop wondering. 4.5 million men went into the ground of the Eastern Front without a grave. Most of them are there still, and most of them always will be. But every spring, someone goes looking anyway. Because a man is only truly missing for as long as no one is searching for him. And somewhere, under the moss, another one is waiting to be found. If you believe these men deserve to have their names spoken again, stay with us and follow along, so that the ones we can still find are not lost a second time.